Okay, today's program. About 3.5 years ago, I moved into a home with my life partner over there, Renee. And across the street, neighbors, Beth Shadur and Bruce Mazer, and just kind of, going out to get the paper in the mornings to say hello and all that kind of thing. Well, I was talking with Beth one morning, and she said, "Are you retired?" Yes. "What did you do?" I told her, and I happened to mention to her that I used to work on the program Barney and Friends, Purple Dinosaur Show. And she went, "Oh my God, really?" Well, she thought this was the greatest thing since flush toilets. Well, I said, "What do you do?" She says, "Well, I'm an artist." I said, "Oh," I said, "Does your work show anywhere?" "Yeah," she told me. And I said, "Oh, okay." When I got home, I Googled Beth. She's a big deal. I'll just read this because I have it prepared. Beth Shadur is an artist, educator, and curator whose artwork has been exhibited in museums and galleries in the United States and abroad. She has created over 150 murals as commissions and community projects, including participatory murals with students in schools. Her newest work, the National Park Project, that's going to be part of her presentation today, undertaken with an artist grant from the Illinois Arts Council agency. This project involved her visiting various national parks for research by hiking and photographing for eventual painted images, researching the various risks brought on by climate change and environmental policy, and looking into the cultural history of the land and its community. So without further, as they say, Beth Shadur.
Well, thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here, and I'm going to speak, and everybody can hear me okay? Good. I'm going to be speaking about a little broader than just the National Park Project that I'm working on, because I'd like to tell you a little bit about the history as well as more current projects that look at the idea of art of social conscience. I'd like to dedicate this to the memory of my folks. My parents were very involved in social justice, and they taught me that my role as a human being was to pursue social justice, and I was lucky enough to do it as an artist. So my work comes from two sources. I do paintings in my studio, and those will be what I'll show you at the end. And as Bob mentioned, I also do community-based mural projects and mural commissions, and have done these for more years than I want to tell you. The idea for the lecture actually comes from my Jewish background. The Jewish concept of teshuvah, the idea in Judaism, one of the tenets of Judaism, that we can constantly overcome the past and make ourselves better and the world better. We address that idea of renewal. Jews do this on a yearly basis on Rosh Hashanah, but they also do it on a weekly basis on Shabbat. And then we're asked as Jews to wake up every morning and think about how you can make yourself and the world a better place. And that's the idea of tikkun olam, taking care of or healing the world. The focus of this talk is to look at how artists can use the power of art to change lives, both in their methodology and in their metaphysical use of artistic language as iconography. I'll include my own work that focuses on environmental justice and on how humans have impacted those pristine landscapes that we consider most sacred. After addressing briefly some history of how artists have used their art to achieve social purpose and change, I'd also like to look at various ways that artists have come out of their studios to create art as social activists. There's a wide variety of examples of this, and artists can work in many different kinds of communities to serve this social purpose. I'll also address how some artists use their own studio work to address issues, social issues. And this work has become known as socially engaged art and has become a major focus of the contemporary art world. Now, I understand there may be cynics among you who don't believe that art can change lives. But I truly believe in the power of art, and I've seen its impact over the years in the work that I've undertaken and in looking at the work of others. I've seen children that have changed from being troubled children with behavior disorders to being leaders of their classroom by working on a mural with me. I've seen this many, many times, and I hope by the end of this talk, I'll have convinced those who are dubious of what art might offer to the lives of those who might never have considered its impact. Now, I'm not getting the advance on this. Oh, sorry, hold on. I'm more technologically challenged than my husband, who will do a very good job of this. Okay. It's not advancing. So artists historically have been behind issues and behind progressive causes. We'll get there.
Yeah.
Yes. The role of the artist has always been to raise levels of awareness, question, and educate. The earliest art had a natural social role, as early as the cave paintings, which were used to portray the hunt and used to communicate during a time when there wasn't developed language. Art in non-Western societies in general have always been art with a specific social purpose. So you think of things like African masks, basketry, things that are functional and had a real purpose in society. But we're going to primarily look at a whirlwind tour of selected works of Western art to look at the changing function of art. In various cultures throughout history, the role of the artist was to portray and glorify those in power. Because artists were hired by patrons to create artwork, the individual expression was primarily stylistic, but less about content of the work. So very early art that we saw was either religious or had a patronage of the government. Religious works such as this mosaic from Ravenna from the 4th century was about Bible stories that were created for those who were illiterate. And you have to remember at that time, most of the population was illiterate. So they couldn't read the stories, but they could see them portrayed. And you see here, The Last Supper by Da Vinci served pretty much the same purpose. But in the Renaissance, some artists, while part of the patronage system, were able to create more individual expressions of the state of mankind. Michelangelo's work here expresses his deepest consideration of the spiritual content in the struggles of man. Images of war at this time were always showing war as an heroic act. Oh, wait, I'm just going to show you one more from the Sistine Chapel, a detail. But so that war was considered heroic, you would see paintings that glorified war because this was a way to glorify the government. So, and it glorified war as a romantic ideal. But the first artist in Western history to depict the harsh realities of war was Jacques Caillot in 1633 in his Miseries of War Prints. And these etchings, this one and the next one, actually show the public, which had no access to the miseries and effects of battle, and there were no newspapers to record such events. So these prints were kind of the primary source of showing what war could be like, showing the bodies and so on. Many artists throughout history viewed these prints as the most influential prints in history, leading the way to art intended for a larger social impact. On the whole, up and during the 18th century, there actually began to be a split where patronage was no longer just government, but also private patronage. So people had portraits painted of themselves and so on. But art then became a privilege of the wealthy. And that was the beginning of elitism that's still prominent today when you think about who goes to museums, who goes to galleries, and who buys art, of course. But there were always artists that operated outside the mainstream who used their art to express ideas that were separate from private or public patronage. So beginning in the 19th century, when they were now free from patronage, those who had a strong social conscience began to do works that reflected that social conscience. And you see here the Disasters of War series by Francisco de Goya his lithographs, and these were among the most powerful images of war ever created. He depicts with great realism, without glorifying violence, the horrors of the Peninsular War, which took place from 1808 to 1814. And the work here, instead of focusing on glorifying war, focuses on the suffering of individuals with gruesome and personal images of death. There's a real focus on human suffering that's still relevant today, and it could be of any war. So bear in mind that these were made during a time when war was generally depicted as heroic, grand in scale, with large-scale battle scenes. In Europe, an artist well known for her art-making appeals on behalf of the working poor was Kata Kollwitz. Her work served as an indictment of social conditions in Europe during the late 19th and early 20th century. Images of death, war, and injustice dominate her work, and she came into contact with the needy because her husband was a doctor, and she would accompany him into impoverished areas of the city. Because of her beliefs and the nature of her art, she was actually expelled from the Prussian Academy in 1933 and harassed by the Nazi regime as a degenerate artist. In the United States, and by the way, I will be showing more positive images, so don't worry, it's not all about death and destruction. In the US, the first images of war made available to the public were actually created with the development of photography. Photographers such as Timothy O'Sullivan and Matthew Brady accompanied armies during the Civil War and created works that showed the actual price of human battle. And remember, suddenly with the advent of photography, the reality of social situations could be presented with an unflinching eye. It created greater public awareness of various social situations, and it served society to widen awareness of the impact of both war and political decisions. And it's really the earliest precursor to that which we think of now as public media, TV, the internet, and so on. Photography was a natural means through which artists could make the public aware of social ills. In the early 1900s, photographer Louis Hine photoed children working in factories in deplorable conditions, and he helped influence the passing of child labor laws prohibiting such labor. And here was an artist who was actually able to affect public policy. And then during the Great Depression, photographers like Walker Evans and Dorothea Lange were sponsored by the Works Progress Administration to photo document American life in all aspects. And they could document the ravages of poverty, the impact of mass unemployment. In the 1930s, the WPA also recognized the importance of the arts to help enact social change and employed artists like Jackson Pollock and his teacher, Thomas Hart Benton, to create murals for public spaces. And they were meant to be uplifting. They were often showing images of workers, and they wanted to show workers as being monumental in scale and heroic for building part of society. And one of the more local ones is in this post office in Lakeview. It's still there. And you can see the large worker on either side, and then showing some of the factory where the Chicago fire, the earliest history of the Dearborn, Fort Dearborn, and then finally the city that they helped to build. And here's a detail of that. One of the most famous works of political significance, of course, was Picasso's Guernica, conveying his rage and sorrow at the brutal slaughter of the defenseless population of refugees and unnamed civilians as the Germans bombed the Basque town of Guernica during the Spanish Civil War. The Spanish town was bombed relentlessly for 3 hours on market day to test the Nazi strategy called Blitzkrieg. There was an unprecedented slaughter of non-combatants. And to show you the power of this image, which of course shows a mother holding a baby who has been killed and the horse that's screaming and so on, I'll show you one detail of it. To show you the power of this work, a tapestry of this work was actually in the UN, a tapestry reproduction hanging outside the Security Council chamber. And when Colin Powell announced that we were going into war in Iraq, they covered it because they didn't want anybody to look at an image of the horrors of war. So Among the most influential movements for contemporary artists was the Mexican mural movement beginning in 1922. Murals like these by Diego Rivera, first of all, were created in very open public spaces where most people could see them from the general public. It wasn't just in a museum where it was tucked away and somebody had to go specially to see it. These murals functioned to address the issues of collective justice and to reflect the ideals of the Mexican Revolution. And they also showed, this particular one shows Mexico ayer, hoy y mañana, Mexico yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And it actually emphasized what was Mexican, what was indígena to Mexico, rather than looking to the influence of Europe. So it was the first art that was really created for the people of Mexico, so that they could be proud of their heritage. And this is actually in a government palace, which is open to anybody. And you can see the workers here. You actually see in right here, this is Frida Kahlo, who is his wife, and he showed her educating people. She was very devoted to the Mexican Revolution. And they were political intent, and the idea was to look at how Mexicans, to be proud of being Mexican, but also to mock the capitalist society. So you see here these figures that are drinking martinis, but also reading their stock. There's the stock information, and that's contrasted to something like this, where a leader of the revolution is handing out guns and people are meeting about how they're going to revolt. So he is contrasting decadent images of those wealthy revelers with celebratory images. The idea of these works in the Mexican mural movement were to really reflect that idea of pride in Mexican culture, and that anticipated the murals that took place in the United States, some of which I'll be showing you, that looked at multiculturalism and celebrated various different cultures. One of the most well-known artists, as well as Diego Rivera, was David Alfaro Siqueiros. Siqueiros created a whole hall that's called the March of Humanity, and you see figures throughout it. And some of the Chicago mural artists who started murals early on in the late 1960s, early 1970s, actually studied and worked with Siqueiros. And you can see a detail here. And one of the things that I emphasized is the idea that this was art out in public spaces. This is actually in Hospital La Raza, so it's in a hospital. And when people go for treatment, they actually are living with and seeing a huge monumental work of art that's very important and a world-class work of art. So this was right in the hospital, people waiting for cancer treatment. And you can see it shows very early images of radiation. So moving now into the United States, and this is where I got my start in the community mural movement. Many artists, particularly in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and particularly in Chicago, New York, and LA, artists of color felt marginalized by the gallery system that showed only work of white males. Not that that has changed so much. They were interested in subject matter that moved away from minimalism, which was abstract art, like a white canvas that had a little dot on it, something like that, or pop art, which was more humorous and lighthearted. And they wanted to show subject matter that reflected their social concerns, and it was created in the streets by artists and also included sometimes non-artists in the creation of these works. The most well-known person, kind of the granddaddy of the mural movement, was William Walker. That's him up on the ladder. This was called the Wall of Respect. It recently had its 50th birthday, and they did all kinds of celebrations all over Chicago related to this. Books have been published. You can see here that different portions of the mural were painted by different artists. And the idea was to reflect various concerns. By the way, that mural was consistently updated and changed by new artists that came along. But also, this was the idea of that the message would empower various communities and that the sites would not be wealthy downtown sites, but things out in the neighborhoods, or such as this one, the history of the packing house worker, that's at the Meat Cutters Hall. And there were murals that abounded in different union buildings and so on. So the work was taken out of that elite realm of the museum and brought out into the street. And this was called the Wall of Peace and Understanding. And what was interesting about this mural, it actually was on the northwest side of Chicago, is whitewashed probably about 20 years ago now. Used to see it on the L. And if you look in this lower portion here, this shows newspapers there, right? It shows like a banner that shows different newspaper clippings. That was constantly updated to reflect new issues. In addition, the people marching here, and I know it's a very dark slide, but it has Jesse Jackson in there. A lot of the leaders of the Black movement, power movement, were included in this mural. And then it shows a shootout between neighborhood gangs and police, which actually took place at this site. And you can see here, it's been updated on the lower left. So now there's different images. And you can see Jesse Jackson, I don't know if you can tell it's him, he was very young, right in the center there. So this is one of the most well-known murals. And then part of the interest in this was to show Black culture and show the importance of Black culture. So there were murals in LA, in New York, that showed predominantly Black leaders from the community. Another thing that was important about this kind of work is that murals were created to be seen very quickly and very easily. So a mural like this, you could drive by and easily get the message. It's called Break the Grip of the Absentee Landlord. It was on the west side of Chicago. And if you remember, during the riots, many buildings were burned. And so there were a lot of empty lots. This was created in one of those empty lots. And you can get the message very easily because the figures are monumental, very simple. But also, if you look at the painting style, a lot of it is just simple painting where you just block something in with a color. So people from the neighborhood who had no art experience could actually come and work on it. So that's where the methodology comes in, that if you engage people in the community, not just in terms of subject matter, but in the making of a project, that people buy into it and it becomes a valuable experience for them. And that's the kind of work that I've done through the years. Another wonderful example of this was this mural by John Weber. It took place on the site of an actual gang fight between a Hispanic gang and a Black gang. You can see on the right the gang fight. You can see the two hands clasped together, and then you see the young man who was killed actually going off on the left here. Okay, and then the signs that talk about justice and so on. Well, John Weber decided, since this corner was really a corner in dispute, he was going to work with gang members from both gangs. And he did. And guess what? The gangs stopped fighting each other, and they both protected this mural. So no graffiti on the mural in all the years that it existed, and it has been repainted. But you can see where sometimes when people work together on something, even though they can be enemies or think of themselves as enemies, suddenly they come together and work on a meaningful project and they get over those differences. So that's very important. And that's an important part of these murals. And this is another mural by Carol Yasko. This was done on the side of a McDonald's in a lot. And it reflected what was going on in that area where farmland became something, was turned over to industry. So you see that kind of subject matter reflected in there. Another thing that murals do is they're site specific. You don't just take a mural and throw it up on a wall and not think about the space that you're working in. And you can see how the wall shape here becomes a portion of the design. So the movement from left to right, and then of the man moving also, with the machine going to the right, it really flows because of the use of that wall shape. Many of these murals did reflect multiculturalism, and this particular mural was one of my favorites. This was when I got my start, was at the time this was created. And it was created to look at the parallels of Latin and Asian American history in Chicago. And you can see the workers, the struggles, and then the hope. And this is a detail of that. And murals that are out in the neighborhood to express this idea of hope. There are many, many murals now in Philadelphia that are all part of this movement. And they have a whole program called the Mural Arts Program. It's really a fascinating program. One of the things that they do is they do huge, huge murals. And instead of painting them directly on the wall, they actually paint them on a kind of parachute cloth that's durable. And for that reason, they can be painted during the winter as well. And then they're actually adhered to the wall. Very famous mural on the west side of Chicago, or south side of Chicago, A Time to Unite. So again, this reflection of multiculturalism, pride in your community. And then sometimes murals were just the importance of being in a neighborhood. So Olivia Goudet on the right, on the scaffolding, this mural was in a viaduct in Hyde Park. She reflected people in the neighborhood, their portraits are painted, and then their thoughts are actually written onto the wall as part of the design of the wall. So it really empowers citizens to explore their history, make decisions about their visual environment, and to have a real sense of pride in their community. And a project like this, sometimes murals are created with youth, and particularly youth that are at-risk youth. My longtime colleague and friend Lynn Takata created this from this boy's design. He created this. This is made out of concrete. So he designed the creature, this fantasy creature, and then the children were involved in doing the mosaics for it. Now I'm going to show you a project of mine, and I want to explain a little bit about the process of a collaborative mural. So when you work in a community to do a mural, this is the beginnings of a mural I did in Ravenswood in Chicago in 1980. I worked with 60 participants from the neighborhood, ranging in age from 10 to 60. And the first thing we did, I was a CETA worker. I met with the neighborhood, talked about their history, what they wanted to show. We people who were interested in it did some research. We all got together. When we came together, we worked on making decisions as to what would be included, what would not be included. We then created a collaborative design. And the collaborative design in black and white looks like, whoops. Oh, thank you. I have a helper. Okay, you take that and I'll take this end. You can see it's drawn to scale. Whoops. And this was what the design looked like in black and white. Okay, at the time that we did it, we then published the design in the newspaper. And you can come up and look at this after the talk if you want to see it more closely, because it's a little hard to see. But we talked about the ideas, and some people in the neighborhood were objected to certain ideas in the original design. So we revised the design because we wanted the design to reflect the neighborhood. And then the participants came and worked on it. And as I said, we had many, many painters. This took many, many months to do. It's a huge mural. This young lady was 10 years old. She was a skater. She would go figure skating first thing in the morning, and then she'd come to me and be there waiting for me every single morning. She is now a professional artist in probably her 50s. And this was the finished mural. So it showed, if you remember, the Ravenswood was originally, there were truck farms that were the original feeders of our society here in Chicago. Riverview was an important part of Ravenswood. We showed a house that was typical of Ravenswood. And then after the Chicago fire, the Bach Brickworks actually created the brick that rebuilt Chicago. And then to the left, it shows the transportation and architectural history. So as it goes back in space, it goes back in time. I've also wanted to mention that many artists have worked in unusual settings as kind of like artists in residence. I actually went early in my career to Scotland and did a mural in a maximum security prison where I created the mural with prisoners, staff members, and visitors. The most famous resident of this prison was an artist named Jimmy Boyle, was a prisoner named Jimmy Boyle, who found art and began to carve stones from the tenements he grew up in. He grew up in the worst slums of all of Europe. He was very involved in crime as a very young man, but they began to bring, actually a art therapist came in, brought clay. He was amazed at how he was able to reproduce something that looked like one of the other prisoners, and he began to carve, and he has now been paroled. He, well, this is a lot of years ago. This was done in, I was back there in 1976, 75, 76. So anyhow, he wrote an autobiography, which became a bestseller in all of Great Britain. By the time he got out, he became head of the anti-drug campaign for all of Great Britain. And he continues to be an artist today. Now he's in his late 70s. And this is one of his sculptures. He had actually had shows in galleries in Edinburgh at the time I was there. So the idea of this mural was called The Wall of Neglect. It showed a system, and this was, again, designed with participants. So you can see some of the drawings are slightly cruder because these prisoners never had done art before. So we show a system of men and machines that are all feeding a rich capitalist in the corner. You only see his leg here. I didn't include that detail. But one of the things we did in order to make it feel less claustrophobic was we created that idea of trompe-l'oeil, which means fool the eye, to take the space back endlessly so that the prisoners wouldn't feel quite so cooped up. These prisoners, by the way, were allowed to move throughout the unit. They were, this was set up to house Scotland's most violent prisoners. They had caused riots from solitary confinement. They did an experiment where they brought them all to this thing called the special unit. There were psychiatrists, psychologists attached to it, all kinds of people that came and visited. They allowed the prisoners to design their own activity and day. They were only locked in their cells overnight, and they were responsible for keeping the place clean, for cooking, for setting up the groceries, and there was no more violence from these guys. So, and then finally, we have you remember the child from the Biafran poster. Most of you are of the age that you would remember that. So that's what we used him as a witness for this mural throughout. And then I'm going to show you quickly some works that I've done with various youth. So this is a mural done in a high school to reflect multiculturalism, Stevenson High School in Lincolnshire. This was a project where I worked with gifted youth at Malcolm X College, but they were high school students. One of the boys drew this picture of muddy water, which is, I think, extraordinary. I don't think I could draw it as well. We made the mural on panels. It was done over 8 sessions, and we actually made it look like it was a notebook. Now, one of the young men here has kept up with me. This was done in 1978. He has kept up with me, become a professional artist. He would call my mother every time I would move and say, "Can you give me Beth's telephone number now?" And he kept up with me all these years, and he became an artist. So that's very inspiring. And then another mural done with a different kind of community. This was done on the streets of Miami Beach. It was done with Black, Hispanic, and Jewish participants, called Building Bridges Crossing Boundaries. It reflected a conference that was taking place at the time with all these participants. And you can see they come together to light these candles for both Kwanzaa, Shabbat, and so on. And then one of my favorite things about murals is that when you work in schools, they can be very educational. So one of my very favorite projects was this one in Davenport, Iowa, where I was the artist in residence for this school. And these children were studying immigration. And lo and behold, I found out that Davenport is the place that the railroad first crossed the Mississippi River. So it was a real center of immigration of all different groups. So these kids researched it. I brought them primary research, real letters from people who had immigrated in the 1800s. I took them to museums, different museums that reflected that. I went to the Swedish Museum and brought them stuff from there. And they incorporated it all into this final mural. And it kind of looks like a WPA mural. One of the things we did, we took the idea from that mural where you saw the writing on the wall that was the neighborhoods. I loved that. So I talked to them about that, and we put some writing in that was kind of like a ghost, white writing that was like the ghosts of the past were speaking today. And then I'm just going to show you some other examples of works that have been done in various places. This is a mile-long series of murals that show the alternative history of California, done by well-known artist Judy Baca. And then a few that are in Philadelphia, and these I think are absolutely incredible. I love the Philadelphia murals. This mural called The Wall of Peace, and obviously it's very important to the neighborhood because all these kids came to pose when the picture was taken. And then finally, the last murals I'm going to show you before I move to other things is there was a whole program set up in Philadelphia from Graterford Prison where families of victims, victims advocates, and mural artists worked together. It included the idea of discussion and dialogue, and they painted murals that reflected the difficulties that inmates have when they're released, and also the difficult paths for victims of crime. And this is one of the murals that was done called Picturing Our Dreams. And there's that one. And let's see, I'm going to need you to change this. Okay, and then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about artists who, and I'm going to show this quickly so I can get to the last National Park Project works, but artists who confront social issues through their imagery itself. And okay, so sometimes the idea is that you want art to heal. So this was a commission that I had where I worked in a rehab hospital. Patients there were residents, and they had been there for a very long time. This was in the rehab room. They told me they wanted a warm, embracing landscape, but it couldn't be too trompe-l'oeil, fool the eye, because patients who had brain injuries might walk into the wall. So what I did is, off to the left, this is a door that really opens. So the gate opens. I painted the gate on there to look like it really opens. While I was working there, this took, maybe a month or two. While I was working there, I would walk by with my buckets, and paints and so on. And a woman who I would see all the time came by and she kind of croaked out, "That's beautiful." And all the nurses came running over and they said, "Oh my God, she hasn't spoken in a year." And I can't tell you how thrilling that was for me. It was just fantastic. So this is a detail. And then some artists come out of their studios. This is a well-known artist in New York named John Ahern. And what he decided to do is he creates studio works that are busts of people. And he sells them through galleries. He's very famous, very well-known. But he also goes out into neighborhoods and works and casts busts of people in the neighborhood. And he works with an Hispanic artist named Rigoberto Torres. And this is one of his gallery works, but you can see he's paying homage to just regular people in the neighborhood. And then one of my very favorite, even though this is a very old project, this was a project from 1988, created by Barbara Donahue and Andy Bardwell, called Amber Waves of Grain. It has a very patriotic title, but what it shows is, it shows at that time our nuclear arsenal. It was created out of tiny clay reproduction, little clay pieces. And the numbers are pretty unbelievable. 31,500 strategic and tactical nuclear warheads, 1,600 strategic land and sea-based missiles, and so on. I don't know what the numbers are today, but it was a very effective piece, and it traveled to various college campuses. This was at Drake University. And then another artist who looked at the impact of war is Carrie Iverson, who's primarily a glass artist, but during the Iraqi war, she decided to give actual face to people some of the soldiers who had died. And so she read all of their stories. She took from the newspaper, she expanded them. This was visible from the Ravenswood Line L. And she paid homage to them by showing their stories. Sometimes there were candles in front. It was a very, very powerful piece. And then two more artists I'm going to show you before I get to the National Park works. LaShonda Crow Storm is a friend and colleague of mine, young Black artist from Indianapolis. She was from Chicago, moved to Indianapolis. She's been working on something called the Lynching Project, where she looks at women who were lynched throughout Black history. She creates these huge, beautiful quilts, which actually quilts are historical to the Black community. But if you look along the sides, she's listed the name of every Black woman who is lynched from our earliest days. They're very powerful. And then the last ones that I'm going to show you before I get to my own work is Bonnie Peterson, who's a friend and colleague of mine. She does quilts. They're beautiful quilts, but the quilts are all about scientific issues like global warming. So in this one, it's called It's Just Math, but she has charts that are quilted in showing the level of carbon dioxide in the stratosphere, all kinds of things. She also uses photo transfers, and they're very, very beautiful quilts, but she is telling the story of the things we need to pay attention to. She's done them on all different subjects. She just had a very major show at the Peggy Note of Art Nature Museum that was on climate reality. And then finally, I'm going to show you one more climate series of work. Some of you may have seen the Cool Globes project, in which artists were asked to create, and it was an environmental public art project, and artists were asked to look at issues of global warming and address one issue or another. And they were shown along along the lakefront by the Field Museum, and then they've traveled all over the globe. And I actually was asked to do one of them. I did mine from the idea of for the seventh generation, which is that you take care of the earth for the 7 generations to come. It's a Native American concept. I used Native American imagery in there. And I also do a lot of collaborative work with a poet. She wrote a poem for it, which is on the upper left. And I include symbols from all different cultures, including Judaism. And then that's very much a Native American image. And then I'm going to get to my own work that looks at social issues. So my work has been for many years now looking at it was called From the Fragility of the Sacred series. It comprises paintings and individual handmade books that integrate idea, text, and visual images with the theme of fragility. It's depicted through symbolism and choice of subject matter, such as this one, which looks at the melting of glacial ice in Banff. And I was an artist in residence in Banff and created it. I've also gone to Iceland as an artist in residence. So I'm attracted to pristine, beautiful environments and want to go look at those issues there. So you can see I also, like Bonnie, include charts sometimes. And then in this particular aspect of the book, this is all painted in watercolor. If you see the green dotted line, that's where the glacier actually went up to years ago. So I include that. I also did a work in 2014, which is a handmade book. And this looks at the impact of gun violence on youth in Chicago. So for 1 year, I tracked every person 21 and younger who was killed by gun violence. And I did work with my poets. So the imagery comes a lot from the poetry. And then on the back, on the right, I've listed every name of these youth with their age and the date that they were killed. And then the middle section actually has all kinds of research on the social impact of gun violence. And that's both in Chicago and national. And then to the left, it has my poet's poem there. You can see the listings here. And there were many, many, way too many names. And this is from that work. Well, finally here, I'm going to get to the part that I promised you, which is the National Park Project. So this recent series aspires to explore the national parks as pristine environments that need to be considered as sacred to protect the land and environment, which serves as our nation's natural legacy. And as Bob mentioned, the beginning research was funded by a grant from the Illinois Arts Council, and that allowed me to go to Utah and do a hike and photograph 5 parks there. Most importantly, I'm reflecting on not only how the parks became parks and how they were the land was taken away from Native Americans, but on the impact of climate change, tourism, man's use of natural resources. And the paintings reflect these concerns by representing the natural beauty, plants and animals impacted and threatened, and using text to address the fragility of the national environment. And I just want to start out by telling you a little bit about how the national parks were formed, and then I'll get on to the paintings. When the national original acts were created by our government to create and protect national parks with the intent to preserve wilderness, there was no recognition of the fact that these lands had been inhabited historically by Native peoples. The untold story behind our unspoiled views in virgin forests is this. These landscapes were inhabited, their features named, their forests utilized, their plants harvested, and animals hunted. Native Americans have a history in our national parks measured in millennia. They were forcibly removed, and later treaty rights to traditional use such as hunting and fishing were erased, often without acknowledgement or compensation. And right when they were formed, these parks were advertised as a showcase of uninhabited America, nature's handiwork unspoiled. So this is really the true history of the national parks. Fortunately, in current days, tribal rights are being restored so that in a place like Glacier National Park, the east end of Glacier National Park is actually owned by Native Americans and run by Native Americans. So if we look at, this is called warming peril. So one of the things I'm going to talk about is the fact that due to climate change, Glacier National Park has actually gone from originally 150 glaciers. At this time, only 25 glaciers remain. And by 2030, all are predicted to be gone. The reduction of glacier size is shown in the painting. So this is 1913. This is what's left of that little itty bitty glacier. In 2012, it's gone now. I actually show various areas that show important features of the park, and I always include text that tells statistics about the park. One of the things that happened with global warming in 2017, I was there, and the wildfires were the worst. It was the worst wildfire season that had ever been in Glacier National Park. While I was there, the Sperry Chalet, which is very famous here, burned to the ground. And I actually had to leave after 1 week instead of staying 2 weeks. My husband was going to meet me. I was with my best friend there, and I stayed for a week with her, and we went hiking, and that's where a lot of the imagery is from. Then my husband came to join me, but I called him and said, guess what? It's too smoky. We can't go anywhere. So we luckily went down to Yellowstone at his suggestion. But, you know, it really showed the impact of this, and that's what this painting is about. And you can see some of the details here. You can see the Native American use up at the top right with the teepees along the shoreline. I always pay homage to Native American use of these parks. And then I'm going to move on to this park, which is called the Hidden Spirit Theodore Roosevelt National Park, which most people don't know. This park was actually named a park by Theodore Roosevelt. It has absolutely magnificent natural features, such as the painted rocks and all kinds of, these are like mushroom forms. I also show in here plants and animals that are threatened. So you see these are different plants that are threatened. Early inhabitants of the park, this is a Native American woman. You can see the Native American chief. There's bison in this park, there's wild horses in this park, but it's being impacted terribly by fracking. And so what's happened is a whole town that didn't exist before now exists there, and the trucks drive up and down the edge of the park, which impacts with noise pollution, light pollution, pollution from, because they're not electric vehicles. And so the park is threatened, and you can see what a gorgeous, gorgeous park it is. For each of my paintings that I do, these are quite large. They're about this big. I also do small ones that just are some things that are not part of, that I wasn't able to include in the park. And by the way, you can see here the impact of fracking written in text. So I always write these statistics and information. And so this is one of the things that you see in this park. And this is a little tiny painting. So for each park, I do one big one and a series of little ones that show some of the beautiful natural areas that unfortunately are so threatened. So here's one of Arches National Park, again, looking at the threats. This owl on the lower left, I'm a big owl fan, as Bob knows, is threatened in many of the parks, all of the Utah parks. This Mexican spotted owl is endangered. And and that there's one of the small details, of small paintings like this that I've done for that. This was Mammoth Cave National Park, the last park we visited before the pandemic closed everything down. And this park has a very interesting history because gypsum was found in it in the caves very early and was used for creating gunpowder for the Civil War. Some of the earliest visitors to the park were Black Americans. And so some of the earliest guides when it became a national park were Black Americans. This fellow in the lower left was one of the first ones. His great, I don't know how many greats, grandson is still a guide in the park. So it's very cool. Blacks that came to visit this, however, couldn't stay in any of the hotels that were nearby. So if you look in the lower right, there's actually this over here, there's actually was a resort that was founded for Blacks to come in and stay. So it has a strong history in the Black community. And then at one time, the health department thought that it would be a very good sanatorium. So they actually sent people to stay in here who had tuberculosis. I don't know why they thought it would be so good in there, but anyhow. And these are some details, some smaller paintings of the national park. It has all kinds of amazing formations in it. And then the last one I'm going to show you, or last bunch, this is Sublime from Yellowstone, and you can see, again, all the details. By the way, one of the things that you might notice, they're all painted on maps of the park. So I create a map of the park, and then I put things kind of where they belong. And these are some details of some of the very beautiful areas. Native Americans believe that this lower left part, which is not showing up with the real color, it's very turquoise, so I'm kind of surprised, but they think that that's the beginning of the creation of the world, that spot. So that's a very sacred spot to them. And then these are some of the smaller paintings from Yellowstone. And I've shown these many places. I've had something like 10 solo exhibitions with these works, and specifically throughout the state of Illinois in the beginning, because since I got the grant from the Illinois Arts Council, I felt like I should, somehow do something that benefits Illinois citizens. So I applied for exhibitions all over, and I showed it in 8 places in Illinois, and then I've shown it at other museums outside of Illinois. And then these last ones are from the second to last park that we visited, Black Canyon of the Gunnison National Park. So these are some of the latest paintings that I've actually worked on. And then that shows you a little information. And I'd just like to end this by saying, finally, art has the powers to create pathways to peace and social justice as a language through which social and political barriers can be transcended. Indeed, artists have a responsibility in this world where global issues must concern us to undertake that concept of tikkun olam, or heal the world. In reviewing Ann Patchett's Bel Canto, the Detroit Free Press described what I feel becomes the ultimate role and meaning for art. A provocative and enchanting look at the power art has to suspend real life and to create a better world, one in which differences between people can be erased and the barriers to our best selves be hurdled. Thank you.
That was outstanding, and we're so glad that you gave permission for this to be taped, because there's going to be many thousands that will be wanting to see it.
Oh, thank you.
We have time for a few questions only because of the pizza schedule. But I have one serious one.
Yes.
And when you tackle social justice, you make a statement.
Mm-hmm.
And most of what we saw was uplifting for those of us that support the statement. What's the risk to the artist? Talk to us on how you approach that.
Throughout the years, there have been some risks. For instance, long ago, I'm going to really date myself. Do you remember when Harold Washington was mayor? A Black artist actually put Harold Washington in a bra and panties, and I don't remember what the idea was, but that work was censored and taken out of an exhibit. So there are issues of censorship that sometimes happen. I don't know of situations where artists have actually been harassed or attacked, but in this particular political climate, it would not surprise me.
And sometimes the artwork gets,
Well, and that, I'll tell you, that is is something that really bothers me. You know, now that some environmentalists, and that's a huge cause for me, but I don't have an understanding of why attacking a work of art helps bring attention to the environment. And so artists are doing that, and they've gone into museums and they have glued themselves, thankfully, in most cases, to the glass of the painting. But, you know, a damage can happen. Glue could drip down and go into the bottom of the frame. So I am not for that kind of thing. But I do think it's important to confront difficult issues.
do you have time to stay for pizza and have some questions? We'll take only a couple more, but if you can stay,
I'm sure.
we'd love you to be able to do so. That over here first.
Yes, hello.
Hi.
What effect does graffiti have on your idea about painting?
Yeah,
And when does it become art as opposed to a mess?
right. I understand. So one of the things is that as an artist, you would not like your artwork to be graffitied, for sure. However, if you are creating public work, number one, that is a risk. But number two, if you engage the community, it's much less likely to happen. Now, I will tell you a little funny story. So remember the mural of Ravenswood? At the end of the mural, I have an image of my husband walking our dog on the street. And so that he's walking along like this, and somebody drew pee coming out of the dog because he's walking the dog. You know, okay, you know, that's not the worst thing. It was a little thing. But, you know, I personally don't like the idea of disrespect happening to a work of art. Now, people think of graffiti as disrespecting property as well. And you see a lot of that everywhere. And some of it, I have to admit, is very, very beautifully painted. I'm not so big on, you know, personally don't like the idea of doing something to property that belongs to somebody.
We're just going to take one more.
Okay.
What about the public statues of famous people in the past who were really honored in the past, and now in the present they've been
Taken
dishonored?
down. Yeah. Well, you know, our country is moving toward the concept of decolonialization. It's become a very large movement. And I can understand that Italians, for instance, are upset at Columbus being removed. But on the other hand, you know, people who are native to the area, who were native, went through so many horrible things at the hands of white settlers that we're trying to remedy the history. But it's a difficult issue. It definitely is a difficult issue.
That explains what the value of it was at that time. And then people can understand times have changed, but I think they should put history.
Yeah.
A little piece about the history.
Well, you know, what is really happening is that, for instance, were murals in schools where Native Americans were depicted as warring tribes instead of just being depicted in their life. Many of them are being whitewashed and covered. So they are taking them out. Some of them were very beautiful WPA murals, but there is this, you know, trying to correct history, and it is impacting artwork for sure. You know, I don't particularly know what the answer is. I mean, but personally, I would like to see people respected who were not respected and treated with that kind of respect. And your case in point, you know, somebody else could do a project that shows what really happened that would be right next to it. And then you would have text in between the two showing that. That's one way of solving it, I guess. But you know, a lot of people have taken a lot of grief over this because it's, you know, it's a big issue going on right now, for sure.